This 2018 Honda CBR 1000RR was in a pretty serious crash. I suspect it rear-ended something, judging by the bent forks. But it also had a pretty long slide on its left-hand side, which bent the subframe and wore a hole through the swing arm.
And that was just the damage I knew about before buying it, because later on I discovered that it doesn't even start. But I think it is worth saving, because this was Honda's first superbike with a TFT display, quick shifter and electronic rider aids,
all of which are completely undamaged on this bike.
However, here's the harsh truth.
If this thing doesn't run, then I probably don't want it, because that will be a lot more expensive.
And today, things got even worse.
I don't think it's healthy to be in here anymore.
So today's mission is simple. Figure out why it won't start, and then see if I can fix that.
Since the last video, I've been playing detective, and I've got some more peculiar findings.
When I turned the dash on, I noticed it was in race view, and it had recorded something like 26 lap times.
Well, I guess it would be 26.5 laps if that is how it crashed. But that doesn't support my rear-ending theory. That would suggest it was crashed on track.
And the rear tire supports that theory. It's a sticky Pirelli Supercorsa worn right to the edge.
But the front tire tells a different story.
The front tire is a Michelin, a completely different brand, and doesn't show any signs of being on track.
So these two tires were never on track together.
The cords are also starting to show on the rear tire.
It all seems a bit fishy. Would insurance even pay out with an illegal, worn-out tire like that? And why would you swap out the front tire? But here's some good news. I've made headway sourcing replacement parts for a lot of what is damaged here.
I've got two possible solutions for this holy swing arm.
I've ordered a brand new subframe from Honda.
I've sent the torn seats off to get recovered. I've ordered the broken mirror parts and intake ducts from Honda.
I've got a plan to fix this bent handlebar for free. I've located a headlight since we don't have one at all. I've already got a new taillight, and it's an upgrade from stock. I've also got new foot pegs, a new second-hand stay bracket to replace this bent one, and I'm currently in the process of figuring out fairings.
So I am making progress in the background that you guys will get to see soon.
But anyway, back to the real problem.
Last time I tried to start the bike because there were no obvious reasons that it shouldn't start. The engine is in one piece and is holding all its fluids, but for some reason it wouldn't start. And it didn't sound like a dead battery either.
I voiced my far-fetched fear in the last video. I'm also paranoid. There could be oil in a cylinder from the crash that'll hydrolock it. Probably just paranoia. I don't know how feasible that actually is, so we're gonna be careful. So let's see how possible that really is.
To test my theory, I need to get to the spark plugs. So I started by removing the fuel tank. It only has 4 bolts, but the back 2 are bolted to that bent subframe. The right one tells the story, but thankfully it wasn't completely ripped out, damaging the tank in the process. Then, after disconnecting the breather hoses on top, the fuel line and what I assume are the fuel pump and fuel level sensors underneath, I could lift the tank off, revealing the airbox. It was covered by this blanket, presumably to protect all these connectors, of which there are hundreds. I then removed the airbox lid screws and spent 20 minutes unplugging all of these connectors, holding down the lid. And I was happy to see the relatively clean air filter.
What I'm worried about is that theoretically, if a bike were to tumble at the correct angles, engine oil could make its way up into the airbox and therefore into the engine itself. And since oil is not compressible like air is, when the piston comes up for its compression stroke, it is stopped by the oil. So everything is locked up and can't move. And that is exactly what it sounded like when I cranked it. It sounds like there is something stopping it from spinning, and I'm not sure what else could cause that. It's far-fetched, but not impossible. And I regret to inform you that I learned this from a whistling diesel video of all places. So this tube here was my main concern. This is your crankcase breather tube. So basically my understanding is that pressure builds up in the crankcase and that air needs to be relieved somehow. So there's a tube that runs from your engine into your airbox. Every now and then a small amount of oil comes up through that as well. You can see here, but that's perfectly normal. And you would much rather that excess oil comes up into your airbox than on the road where we ride, because that would be pretty slippery.
But I'd come this far already, so I kept going. And once I'd removed the airbox base from the throttle bodies, covered them up, and peeled back this rubber lining, I could finally see the valve cover and ignition coils. It's a nightmare working in such a tight space, but eventually I was able to disconnect the ignition coils, remove them, and get all my spark plugs out with the help from my microphone's magnet of all things. And just as I thought my wild theory had no merit, things got worse. There was a cat hair, but more importantly, there was a layer of oil around 3 of the spark plugs.
So now that the spark plugs have been removed, there's essentially an escape route for oil that's inside the engine, if there is any. So I'm going to turn it on, hit the starter button, the motor will crank over and theoretically spit out anything that's inside the cylinders. I'm sure there are a lot of disgruntled mechanics right now, but this is the extent of my knowledge. So I'm going to make do with what I know. Why does every bike I work on need a new battery? So I'll be honest with you, what I'm about to attempt, I've never done on such a nice bike before. I have done pretty much the exact same thing on a dirt bike that literally got submerged in water. So we did this to get the water out, but never on a superbike. Okay, let's try again. This isn't really a jumper pack. This is just a battery charger. Not sure if that's going to be enough power. Let's see. I just realized that it probably would want all of these plugs on top of the airbox plugged in to switch on, because this looks like a module to control the fuel injection. So without that, it might not even turn on. And now it turns on, but now it's harder to see what's coming out of the engine.
And so, the moment of truth.
Holy shit.
I don't know what I was expecting to happen, but not getting showered in oil. And it was absolutely everywhere. This was easily one of the worst experiences with a bike I've ever had, because I'm still not 100% sure how the oil even got into the cylinders in the first place.
I hate to say it, but I was right. It's got a check engine light now. Would have been helpful a few days ago. I was right. I hate being right.
And the worst part was that I had to do that again to make sure it was all out. But this time I was less of an idiot and used some paper towels to absorb the mess. So after a few hours of cleaning up my mess, I came back with a plan.
This is a compression tester. I just bought it because I have never done a compression test in my life, but I'm keen to learn. So to oversimplify it completely, this is basically a health check for your engine. To be a smidge more specific, it's a health check for your piston rings and valves.
But first, I wanted to change the oil for 2 reasons. First, it's currently too full, and secondly, I want to have a look at it, because it can tell you a lot about the health of an engine as well. To be honest, all I know is that there weren't any giant metal pieces in it, and it wasn't milky, so there's no water in it. Other than that, I'm not very helpful. I also got to try out my new oil filter removal tool, but it was utterly useless. Lucky it was cheap. So I reverted back to my normal hose clamp and hammer method.
So according to my research, a compression test is supposed to be done when the engine is at operating temperature, because obviously things expand when they get hot. But for obvious reasons, that can't really happen here. It should still, however, tell us how similar the cylinders are to each other, if nothing else.
Even this was harder than I expected. I ended up starting with cylinder 3 because it was the only one I could get threaded in. Then I connected up the pressure gauge, plugged in all the connectors on top of the airbox for the 100th time, and now all I had to do was keep the throttle open and hit the starter for a few seconds for pressure to build. But I got nothing. It clearly wasn't as well sealed as I thought, so I tried again.
Okay, I give up. This is what I get for trying to be fancy with a compression test. You have to get this dangling tube down a 3-inch hole and then somehow get it to thread into the spark plug hole. But this thing just keeps dangling. So I can't even get it threaded, let alone sealed enough to do a compression test. And those are the easier 2 cylinders, the inner ones. The outer ones have the frame in the way, so it really is going to be impossible for me. So I'm going to return to the old-fashioned method, put it back together and see if it'll start now.
So back together it went with fresh spark plugs since the old ones had been sitting in oil. Then it got ignition coiled, its raincoat, a throttle body wipe down, the airbox along with the air filter, and you guessed it, my favorite connectors once again that obviously have their own blankie. And lastly, the fuel tank.
Now for the moment of truth. I can feel my heart is literally racing because this is the difference between this project being possible and impossible, financially speaking. We got every light under the sun, check engine, oil, fuel. Let's go.
Honda might be known for reliability, but I did not expect it to just fire right up. I've never been so excited for a bike to start in my life, especially with so much smoke. But it has to burn off the oil in the cylinders somehow, so it is expected. This audio is also terrible, but it's at least running on all 4 cylinders with no strange mechanical noises, and eventually I couldn't hold my breath any longer.
I don't think it's healthy to be in here anymore.
Judging by the smoke, even when it's turned off, I think there's also oil in the exhaust pipe, which is adding to the smoke.
I'm gonna call that a win. It sounded normal, so I really hope that nothing inside is damaged. I'm gonna have to take it for a ride when I can to burn off the rest of the oil so that it stops smoking and just to see if the engine feels fine. But now that we got that problem sorted out, we can move on.